As pioneering as the Nintendo Switch was in 2017, with its hybrid design which enabled a much fuller console experience than most handhelds had managed in the past, and laying the foundations for the handheld PCs that have flourished in the last few years, the simple fact of the matter is that it has an adapted mobile chipset within it that was barely powerful enough even at that time for most modern games. But this lack of power gave rise to a slew of impossible ports to the console, from Doom to The Witcher 3, really pushing the limit of what the console was capable of, while even Switch exclusives could end up doing similar things. But now here is the Switch 2, and just as we've seen from Sony and Microsoft with their consoles since around about 2016, there is just so much potential for the Switch 1's back catalogue to run better on the new hardware. This comes in a number of forms. We have, of course, got the paid Switch 2 editions, and third parties are also doing their own upgrades and re-releases, but there's also a bunch of games that have had free patches that add support for the Switch 2. And then there is just running basic Switch 1 game code on a more powerful system. And it's this final category that I find particularly interesting and which is the focus for today, because despite both having ARM CPU cores and an Nvidia GPU, there is enough difference in the hardware so that the Switch 2 doesn't actually run Switch 1 games natively. This isn't emulation though, it is instead running Switch 1 games through a translation layer that remaps CPU and GPU calls to the new architecture as necessary. This is the same kind of methodology that allows Windows games to run in Linux via Proton on the Steam Deck, and just as there, Nintendo had to test thousands upon thousands of games to find all of the compatibility errors, then try to fix those, either with compatibility patches for the games or under the hood improvements for the Switch 2's translation layer. However it has come to pass, the improvements can be fantastic. We're going to be sticking primarily with the docked game experience for these comparisons because that's what our capture tools are best suited to. And so we'll start with one of the real problem children on the Switch 1. We've loaded up the demo for Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, a game that had some pretty obvious issues on the original hardware, barely able to hold on to 30 FPS and often going down to the low 20s. And that is before we even think about the split screen co-op mode. On Switch 2, well, it is a practical 30 FPS lock, which just makes the game feel so much better and more consistent, and really allows the Breath of the Wild-like art style to shine. We'll now jump on over to Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes, which came a couple years later and showed really big improvements in terms of the balance and the optimization for the Switch 1. This game didn't just hit a 30 FPS on the Switch 1, it actually had an unlocked frame rate that showed that it was able to go beyond this. Although, since it's in the mid-30s most of the time, it really should have had a 30 FPS cap. But the silver lining here is that because it doesn't have a frame rate cap, this is a fantastic showcase for the Switch 2's inherent power bump. Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes is a near perfect 60 FPS on Switch 2 from our time with the demo. Another example of this is Dragon Quest Builders 2. This game could be really very punishing on the original Switch, especially with much more complex custom creations being shared online. Performance was generally acceptable through the campaign, maybe in the low 20s for busy town areas with lots of NPCs, but the open world gameplay could easily be north of 30 FPS. And again, this comes with an unlocked frame rate, and so it allows for the Switch 2 to really stretch its legs. And it's not far off a straight doubling of frame rate. In more sparse scenes you will get 60 FPS with relatively little issue, though those busier areas and if you're flying around rapidly through the world do pull the Switch 2 back down to the mid to low 50s. Not perfection on this occasion, but still a very good improvement nonetheless. Those three examples have been 30 FPS target games, but what about an unsteady 60? Bayonetta 2 was already a pretty solid game on Switch 1, which was in and of itself a port across from the Wii U, so well within the console's abilities. There can still be relatively minor dips here though within the arena combat, and let's just say that with rare exceptions, the Switch 2 evens those kinds of kinks out really quite nicely. It is, however, in handheld mode where the performance can really significantly drop. That is difficult for us to really illustrate, as I've already explained, but here's one section where you can feel it while just running around. And then here it is on Nintendo Switch 2, where it seems to be a perfectly smooth 60 FPS. By comparison though, Bayonetta 3 was a much more ambitious game from Platinum Games, with the Switch one as its base platform. The disappointing thing here though was that even though Platinum Games were targeting 60 FPS, the ambition of what they were trying to pull off on screen meant that the game would regularly drop down to the low 50s, high 40s, and some of the most sensational action would go all the way down to the 30s. Okay, so what about on Nintendo Switch 2? This is 60 FPS through and through, outside of the most cinematic moments where Platinum Games put in a 30 FPS frame cap. This is pretty much what Bayonetta 3 should have been like upon its original launch. Another problem child from the first party lineup was Xenoblade Chronicles 2. The worst of the problems in this game emerged when playing in handheld mode, where the chip stepped down to a low power modes and the upscaling could get seriously blurry as it tried to keep up. And while it was much more consistent when playing docked, there were still some issues, such as some really severe pop-in, especially when loading to a new area. It was still a handsome game on Switch 1 though, but Switch 2 just comes with some nice improvements to the quality of what you're getting. You've got frame rate issues ironed out, you've got a better base resolution, particularly when in handheld mode, though it's still a little bit blurry, and you've got faster loading in of assets to stamp out that pop-in. These have all been really good examples of how the Switch 2's raw power can enhance a game experience, but it can't fix everything. If a game on Switch 1 was already pretty well attuned to a 30 FPS cap, having all of the graphic settings designed specifically for that, then the only real improvements can come from a better dynamic resolution scaling. Wolfenstein 2 is a key example of this. It's a game that was designed to target 60 FPS on PS4 and Xbox One, but was limited to 30 FPS on Switch, and as Panic Button's second effort with id Tech after Doom, it did a pretty good job of this. But this was achieved by much more than just reducing resolution. The texture detail is massively lowered, and combined with the reduced resolution, this just gives the game a lot of blurriness. Add in some really hefty motion blur, which is much more of a smear when at 30 FPS than at 60, and it makes playing this game on the handhelds less pleasant, regardless of if you're on Switch 1 or Switch 2. Switch 2 can boost the dynamic resolutions, which does help with some of the blurriness, but the top end just doesn't feel that good either. There's a really hard limit to what this game is able to do on Switch 2. And it is a shade ironic, to be honest, that the most tuned and optimized games for the Nintendo Switch might not be able to benefit as much from this kind of raw power improvement. But in general, this is a fantastic showcase of how the Switch 2 can apply its raw power to last generation games and deliver some really tangible improvements. A game with an uneven frame rate can be smoothed out, something with a low dynamic resolution can be improved close to its limits, and a lot of the most troubled games on Switch 1 will just get a better experience on Switch 2. But these games just really aren't making the best of the Switch 2 hardware, which will be limited by frame rate caps and resolution limits. All of the games here would benefit from a Switch 2 patch or even a paid Switch 2 edition release if that is deemed necessary. It would be fantastic to get Age of Calamity running at 60 FPS instead of 30. Bayonetta 2 and 3 both at 1080p would be a dream. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 remastered in general would be great to see because that game deserves a much better resolution and general rendering. And while we didn't include it in this list because it has such a hard limit, having Astral Chain given a 60 FPS frame rate target instead of 30 would just, well, unchain one of Platinum Games' stars for the Nintendo Switch. we have seen these kinds of patches applied to other games, and the results there can also be pretty incredible. Stay tuned for more of our comparisons and videos by liking, subscribing, clicking the bell icon. You know what to do on YouTube these days, and so we'll see you again soon, won't we? Goodbye!